48 Laws of Power, Chapter 36. Disdain things you cannot have. Ignoring them is the best revenge. By acknowledging a petty problem, you give it existence and credibility. The more attention you pay an enemy, the stronger you make him. And a small mistake is often made worse and more visible when you try to fix it. It is sometimes best to leave things alone. If there is something you want but cannot have, show contempt for it. The less interest you reveal, the more superior you seem. The Mexican rebel leader, Pancho Villa, started out as the chief of a gang of bandits. But after revolution broke out in Mexico in 1910, he became a kind of folk hero, robbing trains and giving the money to the poor, leading daring raids and charming the ladies with romantic escapades. He exploited fascinated Americans. He seemed a man from another era, part plots fast another era. His exploits fascinated Americans. He seemed a man from another area, part Robin Hood and part Don Juan. After a few years of bitter fighting, however, General Carranza emerged as the victor in the revolution. The defeated Villa and his troops went back home to the north state of Chihuahua. His army dwindled, and he turned to banditry again, damaging his popularity. Finally, perhaps out of desperation, he began to rail against the United States, the gringos, whom he blamed for his troubles. In March of 1916, Pancho Villa raided Columbus, New Mexico. Rampaging through the town, he and his gang killed 17 American soldiers and civilians. President Woodrow Wilson, like many Americans, had admired Villa. Now, however, the bandit needed to be punished. Wilson's advisors urged him to send troops into Mexico to capture Villa. For a power as large as the United States, they argued not to strike back at an army that had invaded its territory would send the worst kind of signal. Furthermore, they continued, many Americans saw Wilson as a pacifist, a principle the public doubted as a response to violence. He needed to prove his mettle and manliness by ordering the use of force. The pressure on Wilson was strong, and before the month was out, with the approval of the Carranza government, he sent an army of 10,000 soldiers to capture Pancho Villa. The venture was called the Punitive Expedition, and its leaders was the dashing General John Pershing, who had defeated guerrillas in the Philippines and Native America in the American Southwest. Certainly, Pershing would find and overpower Pancho Villa. The Punitive Expedition became a sensational story, and the carloads of U.S. reporters followed Pershing into action. The campaign, they wrote, would be a test of American power. The soldiers carried the latest in weaponry, communicated by radio, and were supported by reconnaissance from the air. In the first few months, the troops split up into small units to comb the wilds of North Mexico. The Americans offered a $50,000 reward in information leading to Villa's capture. When he had returned to banditry, now idolized him for facing this mighty American army. They began to give Pershing false leads. Villa had been seen in the village or in the mountains, hideaway, airplanes, and would be dispatched. Troops would scurry after them, and no one would ever see him. The wild The Willie Bandit seemed to be always a step ahead of the American military. By the summer of that year, the expedition had swelled to 123,000 men. They suffered through the stutely heat and mosquitoes, the wild terrain, trudging over a countryside in which they were already rescinded. They infuriated both the local people and the Mexican government. At one point, Pancho Villa hid in the mountain cave to recover from a gunshot wound he received in a skirmish with the Mexican army. Looking down from his eyries, he could watch Pershing lead the exhausted American troops back and forth across the mountain, never getting any closer to their goal. All the way into winter, Villa played his cat and mouse game. Americans came to see the affairs as a kind of slapstick farce. In fact, they began to admire Villa again, respecting his resourcefulness in eluding a superior force. In January of 1917, Wilson finally ordered Pershing withdrawal. As the troops made their way back to American territory, rebel forces pursued them, forcing the United States Army to use airplanes to protect its rear flanks. The punitive expedition was being punished itself. It had turned into a retreat of the most humiliating sort. Woodrow Wilson organized the punitive expedition as a show of force. He would teach Pancho Villa a lesson, and in the process show the world that no one, large or small, could attack the mighty United States and get away with it. The expedition would be over in a few weeks, and Villa would be forgotten. That was not how it played out. The longer the expedition took, the more it focused attention on the Americans' incompetence and on Villa's cleverness. Soon, what was forgotten was not Villa, but the raid that had started it all. As a minor annoyance became an international embarrassment and the enraged Americans dispatched more troops, the imbalance between the size and the pursuer and the size of the pursued, who still managed to stay free, made the affair a joke. In the end, this white elephant of any army had to lumber out of Mexico, humiliated. The punitive expedition did the opposite of what it set out to do. It left Villa not only free, but more popular than ever. What could Wilson have done differently? He could have pressured the Carranza government to catch Villa for him. Alternatively, since many of Mexicans had tired of Villa before the punitive expedition began, he could have worked quietly with them and won their support for a much smaller raid to capture the bandit. He could have organized a trap on the American side of the border, anticipating the next raid, or he could have ignored the matter altogether for the time being and waited for the Mexicans themselves to do away with the Villa on their own accord. Remember, you choose to let things bother you. You can just as easily choose not to. Notice the irritating offender. To consider the matter trivial, unworthy of your interest, that is the powerful move. What you do not react to cannot drag you down into a futile engagement. Your pride is not involved. The best lesson you can teach an irritating gnat is to co-sign it to oblivion by ignoring it. If it is impossible to ignore, Pancho Villa had in fact killed American citizens, then conspire in secret to do away with it. But never inadvertently draw attention to the bothersome insect that will go away or die on its own. In your waste time and energy in such entanglements, it is your own fault. Learn to play the card of disdain and turn your back on what cannot harm you in the long run. Just think, it costs your government $130 million to try to get me. I took them over rough, hilly country, sometimes for 50 miles at a stretch. They had no water. They had nothing but the sun and mosquitoes, and nothing was gained. Pancho Villa. See, 1878 to 1923. Observance of the law. In the year 1524, King Henry VIII of England decided he had to find a way to get rid of his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had failed to produce a son, a male heir, who could ensure the continuance of his dynasty, and Henry thought he knew why. He had read in the Bible the passage, "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is unclean thing." He had uncovered his brother's nakedness, like they shall be childless. Before marrying Henry, Catherine had married his older brother, Arthur, but Arthur had died 5 months later. Henry had waited an appropriate time, then had married his brother's widow. Catherine was a daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Elizabeth of Spain, and by marrying her, Henry had kept alive a valuable alliance. Now, however, Catherine had to assure him that her brief marriage with Arthur had never been consummated. Otherwise, Henry would view this relationship as incestuous and their marriage as null and void. Catherine insisted that she had remained a virgin through her marriage to Arthur, and Pope Clement VII supported her by giving his blessings to the union, which he could not have done had he considered it incestuous. Yet, after years of marriage to Henry, Catherine had failed to produce a son, and in the early 1520s, she had entered a menopause. To the king, this could only mean one thing: she had lied about her virginity. Their union was incestuous, and God had punished them. There was another reason why Henry waited to get rid of Catherine. He felt he'd fallen in love with a younger woman, Anne Boleyn. Not only was he in love with her, but if he married her, he could still hope to serve a legitimate son. The marriage to Catherine had been annulled. For this, however, Henry had to apply to the Vatican, but Pope Clement would never annul the marriage. By the summer of 1527, rumors spread throughout Europe that Henry was about to attempt the impossible, to annul his marriage against Clement's wishes. Catherine would never abdicate, let alone voluntarily enter a nunnery, as Henry had urged her. But Henry had his own strategy. He stopped sleeping in the same bed with Catherine, since he considered her his sister-in-law, not his lawful wife. He insisted on calling her Princess Dowager of Wales, her title as Arthur's widow. Finally, in 1531, he banished her from court and shipped her off to a distant castle. The Pope ordered him to return her to court on pain of excommunication, the most severe penalty a Catholic could suffer. Henry not only ignored this threat, he insisted that his marriage to Catherine had been dissolved, and in 1533 he married Anne Boleyn. Clement refused to recognize the marriage, but Henry did not care. He no longer recognized the Pope's authority, and proceeding to break with the Roman Catholic Church, established the Church of England in its stead. with the king as the head of the new church. And so, not surprisingly, the newly formed Church of England proclaimed Anne Boleyn England's rightful queen. The Pope tried every threat in the book, but nothing worked. Henry simply ignored him. Clement fumed. No one had ever treated him so contemptuously. Henry had humiliated him and had no power of recourse, even excommunication, which he constantly threatened but never carried out, would no longer matter. Catherine, too, felt the devastating sting of Henry's disdain. She tried to fight back, but in appealing to Henry, her words fell on deaf ears, and soon they fell on no one's. Isolated from the court, ignored by the king, mad with anger and frustration, Catherine slowly deteriorated and finally died in January of 1536 from a cancerous tumor of the heart. When you pay attention to a person, the two of you become partner of sorts, even moving in step to the action and reaction of the other. In the process, you lose your initiative. It is a dynamic of all interactions. By acknowledging other people, even if only to fight with them, you open yourself to their influence. Had Henry locked horns with Catherine, he would have found himself mired in endless arguments that would have weakened his resolve and eventually worn him down. Catherine was a strong, stubborn woman. Had he set out to convince Clement to change his verdict on the marriage validity or tried to compromise and negotiate with him, he would have gotten bogged down in Clement's favorite tactics, playing for time, promising flexibility, but actually getting what popes always got their way. Henry would have none of this. He played a devastating power game, total disdain. By ignoring people, you cancel them out. This upsets and infuriates them, but since they have no dealings with you, there is nothing they can do. This is the offensive aspect of the law. Playing the card of contempt is immensely powerful, for it lets you determine the conditions of the conflict. The war is waged on your terms. This is the ultimate power imposed. You are the king, and you ignore what offends you. Watch how this tactic infuriates people. Half of what they do is to get your attention, and when you withhold it from them, they flounder in frustration. Kick him, he'll forgive you. Flatter him, he may or may not see through you, but ignore him and he will hate you. Desire often creates paradoxical effects. The more you want something, the more you chase after it. The more it eludes you, the more interest you show, the more you repel the object of your desire. This is because your interest is too strong. It makes people awkward and even fearful. Uncontrollable desire makes you seem weak, unworthy, and pathetic. You need to turn your back on what you want, show your contempt and disdain. This is the kind of power response that will drive your target crazy. They will respond with a desire of their own, which is simply to have an effect on you, perhaps to possess you, perhaps to hurt you. If they want to possess you, you have successfully completed the first step of seduction. If they want to hurt you, you have unsettled them and made them play by your rules. See laws 8 and 39 on baiting people into action. Contempt is prerogative. Contempt is prerogative of the king. Where his eye turns, what he decides to see is what has reality. What he ignores and turns his back on is as good as dead. That was the king's Louis XIV. If he did not like you, he acted as if you were not there, maintaining his superiority by cutting off the dynamic of interaction. This is the power you have when you play the card of contempt, periodically showing people that you can do without them. If choosing to ignore enhances your power, it follows that the opposite approach, commitment and engagement, often weakens you. By paying undue attention to a puny enemy, you look puny, and the longer it takes you to crush such an enemy, the larger the enemy seems. When Athens set out to conquer the island of Sicily in 415 BC, a giant power was attacking a tiny one. Yet, by entangling Athens in a long, drawn-out conflict, Syracuse, Sicily's most important city-state, was able to grow in a stature and confidence. Finally defeating Athens, it made itself famous for centuries to come. In recent time, President John F. Kennedy made a similar mistake in his altitude to Fidel Castro of Cuba. His failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 made Castro an international hero. A second danger is you succeed in crushing the irritant, or if you merely wound it, you create sympathy for the weaker side. Critics of Franklin D. Roosevelt complained bitterly about the money his administration sent on government projects, but their attacks had no resonance with the public, who saw the president as working to end the Great Depression. His opponent thought they had an example that would show just how wasteful he had become. His dog Fowler, which he had lavished with favors and attention. Critics railed at his insensitivity, spending taxpayers' money on a dog while so many Americans were still in poverty. But Roosevelt had a response. How dare his critic attack a defenseless little dog? Wow. His speech in defense of Fowler was one of the most popular he ever gave. In this case, the weak party invaded was the president's dog, and the attack backfired. In the long run, it only made the president more sympathetic, since many people will naturally side with the underdog, just as the American public came to sympathize with the wily, about outnumbered Pancho Villa. It is tempting to want to fix our mistakes, but the harder we try, the worse we often make them. It is sometimes more politic to leave them alone. In 1971, when the New York Times published the Pentagon, a group of government documents about the history of the U.S. involvement in Indochina, Henry Kissinger erupted into a volcanic rage. Furious about the Nixon administration vulnerability to this kind of damage leaked, he made recommendations that eventually led to the formation of a group called the Plumbers to plug the leaks. This was the unit that later broke into the Democratic office in the Watergate Hotel, setting off the cabin of events that led to Nixon's downfall. In reality, the publication of the Pentagon's papers was not a serious threat to the administration, but Kissinger's reaction made it a big deal. And trying to fix one problem, he created another, a paranormal for security that in the end was much more destructive to the government. He had ignored the Pentagon papers. The scandal they had created would eventually have blown over. Instead, inadvertently focusing attention on a problem, make it seem worse. By publicizing how much concern and anxiety it is causing you, it is often far wiser to play the contemptuous aristocrat, not disdaining to acknowledge the problem existence. There are several ways to execute this strategy. First, there is the sour grapes approach. If there is something you want but that you realize you cannot have, the worst thing you can do is draw attention to your disappointment by complaining about it. And infinitely more powerful tactic is to act as if it never really interests you in the first place. When the writer George Sand's supporters nominated her to be the first female member of the Acadine franchise in 1861, the academic franchise in 1861, Sand quickly saw that the Academy would never admit her. Instead of whining, though, she claimed she had no interest in belonging to this group of worn-out, overrated, out-of-touch windbags. Her disdain was the perfect response. Had she shown her anger at her exclusion, she would have revealed how much it meant to her. Instead, she branded the Academy a club of old men, and why should she be angry or disappointed at not having to spend her time with them? Crying sour grapes is sometimes seen as a reflection of the weak. It is actually the tactic of the powerful. Second, when you are attacked by an inferior, deflect people's attention by making it clear that the attack has not even registered. Look away or answer sweetly, showing how little the attack concerns you. Similarly, when you yourself have committed a blunder, the best response is often to make less of your mistake by treating it lightly. The Japanese Emperor Go-Sein, a great disciple of tea ceremony, owned a priceless antique tea bowl that all courtiers envied. One day, a guest, Danagon Suhiro, asked if he could carry the tea bowl into the light to examine it more closely. The bowl rarely left the table, but the emperor was in good spirits and consented. As Danagon carried the bowl to the railing of the veranda, however, and held it up to the light, it slipped from his hands and fell on a rock in the gardens below, smashing into tiny fragments. The emperor, of course, was furious. It was indeed most clumsy of me to let it drop in this way, said Danagon with a deep bow. But really, there is not much harm done. This idol tea bowl is a very old, and is impossible to say how much longer it would have lasted. But anyhow, it is not a thing of any public use, so I think it rather fortunate that it had broken thus. This surprising response had an immediate effect. The emperor calmed down. Danagon neither sniveled nor over-apologized, but signaled his own worth and power by treating his mistake with a touch of disdain. The emperor had to respond with a similar aristocratic indifference. His anger had made him seem low and petty, and imagine Danagon was able to manipulate. Among equals, this tactic might backfire. Your indifference could make you seem callous, but with a master, if you act quickly and without great fuss, it can work to great effect. You bypass his anger response. Save him the time and energy he would waste by brooding over it, and allow him the opportunity to display his own lack of pettiness publicly. If we make excuses and denials when we are caught in a mistake or deception, we stir up the waters and make the situation worse. It is often wiser to play things to the opposite. The Renaissance writer Pietro Argentino often boasted of his aristocratic lineage, which was, of course, a fiction, since he was actually the son of a shoemaker. When an enemy of his finally revealed the embarrassing truth, word quickly spread, and soon all of Venice, where he lived at the time, was aghast at Artino's lies. Had he tried to defend himself, he would have only dragged himself down. His response was masterful. He announced that he was indeed the son of a shoemaker, but this only proves his greatness, since he had risen from the lowest stratum of society to be very pinnacle. From then on, he never mentioned his previous lie, trumpeting instead his new position on the matter of his ancestry. Remember, the powerful responses to niggling, petty annoyances and irritations, and contempt and disdain. Never show that something has offended you or that you are offended. That only shows you have acknowledged the problem. Contempt is a dish that is best served cold and without affection. The tiny wound. It is small but painful and irritating. You try all sorts of medicaments. You complain, you scratch, you pick at a scab. Doctors only make it worse, transforming the tiny wound into a grave matter. If only you had left the wound alone, letting time heal and freeing yourself of worry. Know how to play the card of contempt. It is the most politic kind of revenge, for there are many of whom we should have known nothing if their distinguished opponents had taken no notice of them. There is no revenge like oblivion, for it is the entombment of the unworthy in the dust of their own nothingness. You must play the card of contempt with care and delicacy. Most small troubles will vanish on their own if you leave them to be, but some will grow and fester unless you attend to them. Ignore a person of inferior stature, and the next time you look, he has become a serious rival, and your contempt has made him vengeful as well. The great princes of Renaissance Italy chose to ignore Caesar Borgia at the outset of his career as a young general in the army of his father, Pope Alexander VI. By the time they paid attention to it, it was too late. The cub was now a lion, gobbling up chunks of Italy. Often then, while you show contempt publicly, you will also need to keep an eye on the problem privately, monitoring its status and making sure it goes away. Do not let it become a cancerous cell. Develop the skill of sensing problems when they are still small and take care of them before they become intractable. Learn to distinguish between the potentially dangerous and the mildly irritating, the nuisance that will quietly go away on its own. In either case, though, never completely take your eye off it. As long as it is alive, it can smother or spark into life.